2 people were shot inside their own apartment at dawn. One died on the spot. The other was shot directly in the face, collapsing in a pool of blood, but still conscious enough to nod in confirmation of who had pulled the trigger. And the shooter was not some unknown robber. It was the man who had once said he loved her. A brutal betrayal, a vicious act carried out with chilling coldness. Charles Victor Thompson, 27 years old in 1998, later sat in the courtroom with calm composure, as if what had happened was merely a mistake. But this was no mistake. It was a deliberate chain of choices that led to a horrifying crime. Before the gunshots, there were clear warning signs. Glenda Denise Hisley, 39 years old, a single mother, repeatedly appeared with visible bruises and marks of violence that no one intervened to stop in time. The relationship between her and Thompson did not collapse in a single moment. It rotted slowly, twisting from care into control, then into possessive abuse. When Denise decided to leave and start a new relationship with Darren Kane, 30 years old, everything should have ended there. But for Thompson, it was an unacceptable insult. Hours before the shooting, he had been there. Then he left not to calm down, but to prepare for something far worse. 3 hours later, he returned with a gun and carried out a savage attack. This is a case of sick jealousy, of control turning into lethal violence. And every detail you are about to hear is verified through court records, police reports, and witness statements. Around 6 a.m. on April 30th, 1998, while most of the apartment complex in Houston was still wrapped in the quiet of early morning, a violent sound shattered everything. The apartment door was kicked in with such force that the lock burst out of the frame. No knock, no warning, no sign of any attempt at dialogue. Charles Victor Thompson stepped inside holding a semi-automatic handgun, and in that instant, everything was decided. Darren Kane was the first to see him. Darren was in the living room when the door was smashed open. He barely had time to stand up, a natural reflex upon recognizing danger, before Thompson raised the gun and fired. The first shot rang out almost immediately, without hesitation, without warning. Then the second, third, and fourth. Bullets tore into Darren's body, into his chest, into his neck, lethal areas targeted with cold precision. There was no sign of panic or stray shots. Darren tried to react, tried to move, tried to get out of the line of fire, but the distance was too close, and Thompson gave him no chance. As Darren turned to find a way to escape, another bullet was fired from behind, piercing through his body and bringing him down. But even after the victim could no longer resist, Thompson stepped closer. The final shot was fired at point-blank range, like an execution, not in self-defense, not to stop a threat, but to make sure the victim had no chance of survival. That was the moment when violence turned into execution. Meanwhile, Denise Hisley witnessed it all. When the first shots rang out, she ran toward the kitchen, where she might find anything to defend herself. It was a survival instinct, a desperate attempt to escape a man who was killing right in front of her. But Thompson did not stop. He turned the gun on her and kept firing as she ran. One bullet struck the kitchen wall, later noted by investigators as evidence that Denise had been chased, and the pursuer had no intention of stopping. As Thompson advanced into the kitchen area, he fired multiple shots, and at one point during the assault, his gun ran out of ammunition. This is an important detail, because it means he had to pause, had to reload. A brief moment, but enough time to think, enough time to stop, enough time to choose a different path. But he did not stop. He continued. After reloading, Thompson moved toward Denise, who by then was wounded and could no longer run far. The distance between them closed. No more chase. No more chaos of fleeing footsteps. Only a man with a gun and a victim cornered. Thompson pressed the gun to Denise's face at such close range that there could be no mistake about his intent. He spoke a direct threat, not to negotiate, not to warn, but to assert absolute control in that moment. Then he pulled the trigger. The bullet entered from her right cheek, causing severe damage, destroying facial structure and knocking her down. But she did not die immediately. She was still alive, still conscious, though in critical condition. When a neighbor heard the shots and rushed over, Denise was still able to respond. When asked who had shot her, she nodded to confirm it was Thompson. That was one of the most critical moments of the case. An identification coming directly from the victim in the fragile seconds between life and death. At the scene, Darren Kane was dead. His body lay motionless on the floor, riddled with fatal gunshot wounds. No chance for aid. No chance of survival. Denise lay nearby, gravely wounded, bleeding heavily but still breathing. The apartment was no longer a living space. It had become the site of a brutal execution. Every detail in the room reflected the level of violence that had occurred. Shell casings, marks on the walls, blood on the floor. There was no moment that showed Thompson losing control. On the contrary, every action demonstrated intent. He chose to return. He chose to bring a gun. He chose to shoot. He chose to continue while the victims fled. And he chose to finish them when they could no longer resist. Just hours after the shots rang out on the morning of April 30th, 1998, while the scene was still not fully secured and investigators were still collecting scattered evidence in the blood-soaked apartment, Charles Victor Thompson did not flee the way many killers do. He did not disappear, did not try to leave the city, but that does not mean he was innocent or remorseful. Before turning himself in, Thompson took a calculated step. He drove to the Cypress Creek area and threw the murder weapon into the water, attempting to dispose of the gun and erase the direct link to the crime. Afterward, he went to an acquaintance, recounted the details of what had happened, then contacted his father. Together with his father, he went to the police station and surrendered on the same day, April 30th. On the surface, it might appear cooperative, but in reality, it came only after he had tried to eliminate the most critical piece of evidence. Meanwhile, at the scene, investigators began reconstructing what had happened inside the apartment. Shell casings were scattered across the floor in numbers far exceeding what would be needed for self-defense, reflecting a rapid succession of shots. Marks on the walls, especially in the kitchen area, showed that the victims had been pursued while trying to escape. Denise Hisley's statement, though brief and given while gravely wounded, became one of the strongest direct pieces of evidence. When asked who shot her, she nodded to confirm Thompson. That was not speculation, it was identification from the victim in her final moments of consciousness. In parallel, neighbors provided crucial information. Many reported hearing multiple successive gunshots around 6 a.m., consistent with the number of casings found at the scene. There was no sign of a two-way shootout. All evidence pointed in one direction. One attacker, two victims. Recovering the weapon became a key step. Based on the information gathered, including what Thompson had indirectly revealed, authorities searched Cypress Creek. The gun was eventually found underwater. When examined, it matched the ammunition type and casings recovered from the scene. This connection not only strengthened the case, but clearly proved that discarding the gun was an attempt to conceal, not an impulsive act. Medical reports further clarified the brutality of the attack. Darren Cain was struck by multiple bullets in lethal areas, including the chest and neck. Those wounds were sufficient to cause near-immediate death. There was no evidence he had any effective chance to defend himself. That fits the scenario of a surprise, close-range assault. Denise Hisley, meanwhile, suffered a gunshot wound through the face, causing severe damage to bone and soft tissue, along with heavy blood loss and respiratory compromise. She was airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Houston in critical condition. Initially, she remained conscious, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. Due to prolonged oxygen deprivation, Denise slipped into a deep coma. Doctors determined that the resulting brain damage from hypoxia was irreversible. After a week on life support, her family had to face a painful decision. On May 6, 1998, Denise Hisley died, officially turning the case into a double murder. Throughout this process, Thompson did not deny his role. He gave a confession describing the actions he had taken, but what stands out is not that he admitted it, but how he did so. There was no sign of panic, no major inconsistencies in his account. He described the events with relative clarity, as if recounting a sequence of actions he was fully aware of at the time. That further reinforced the argument that this was not an unintended outburst. From returning to the scene hours later, to bringing a weapon, reloading, continuing the attack, then disposing of the gun before surrendering, everything demonstrated a high level of awareness and control. The investigation, built on witness statements, physical evidence, forensic results, and the victim's identification, quickly formed a clear picture. To understand why the attack on the morning of April 30th, 1998, unfolded with such brutality, we must go back to 1997, when the relationship between Charles Victor Thompson and Glenda Denise Hisley began in Houston, Texas. At first, it may have appeared like a normal relationship with affection and closeness, but from the start, signs of instability were present. Thompson was an alcoholic and cocaine user, and those factors quickly influenced his behavior. Instead of building a healthy relationship, he increasingly displayed a need for control. Denise was no longer an independent individual, but became someone he believed he had the right to dominate. As the relationship progressed, that control turned into violence. Denise repeatedly appeared with clear bruises on her body. Those marks were not isolated incidents, but signs of a repeated pattern of abuse. This is a familiar cycle of violence, where each boundary crossed without intervention only convinces the abuser that he can continue. In Thompson's eyes, the relationship was not based on mutual consent, but on his right to control. And when Denise decided to leave, it was not just a breakup. For him, it was a loss of power. After about a year of enduring it, Denise ended the relationship and began a new life. She met Darren Cain, a man whose personality was the complete opposite of Thompson's, calm and protective. Darren's presence not only gave Denise another chance but also intensified Thompson's obsession. He could not accept losing Denise, and he especially could not accept her being with someone else. From that point, his behavior escalated. He made constant calls, showed up uninvited at Denise's apartment, and confronted her about the new relationship. Those actions were not attempts at reconciliation but stalking and intimidation. Denise was kept in a constant state of stress, never knowing when he would appear. The peak of that escalation occurred on the night of April 29, 1998. Around 2:30 a.m., Denise called Darren in a panic because Thompson was in the apartment and attacking her. When Darren arrived, a fight broke out between the two men and lasted about 15 minutes. In the end, Darren gained the upper hand, and Thompson was overpowered. It was at this moment that Thompson changed his demeanor. He apologized, said he would accept Denise being with Darren, and acted as if everything was over. But that change was not remorse, it was deliberate pretense. When police arrived to handle the domestic violence call, the situation appeared stabilized. Thompson was removed from the area. But what happened on the surface did not reflect what was happening in his mind. That reconciliation was only a facade. Beneath it, anger and humiliation were building. He had been defeated in front of Denise and Darren, and for someone with a high need for control, that was unacceptable. His response was not to withdraw, but to prepare. After leaving the apartment complex, Thompson did not go home to rest. He drove home, retrieved a semi-automatic handgun. This was the turning point from conflict to murderous intent. He had time, distance, and opportunity to stop, but he did not stop. About 3 hours later, around 6 a.m., he returned to the apartment. The decision to come back armed made it clear that what followed was not impulsive. It was the result of thought and choice. When looking at the entire sequence of events, Thompson's motive becomes obvious. He could not accept Denise leaving him, could not accept her being with someone else, and chose violence as the way to reassert control. What makes this case particularly grave is not only the act of murder, but the way it was prepared. He had the chance to stop after the fight, had time to think when he left, but every step he took afterward followed the same direction. No hesitation, no effort to avoid consequences. Only one single goal: to return and end everything on his terms. In 1999 in Harris County, Texas, the case of Charles Victor Thompson entered the trial phase, where every detail from the early morning of April 30th, 1998 was presented to the jury not as scattered pieces, but as a complete, logical, and irrefutable chain of events. The charge Thompson faced was capital murder, one of the most serious accusations in the Texas legal system, applied to killings with especially heinous characteristics, including multiple victims and premeditation. From the outset, the prosecution built its strategy around a core argument. This was not an impulsive act, but a clearly intentional murder carried out after the perpetrator had time to think and prepare. They emphasized the sequence of Thompson's actions that night, particularly how he left the apartment after the fight, then returned hours later armed with a gun. That interval was not a minor detail. It was crucial evidence showing he had the opportunity to stop, to walk away from the situation, but instead chose to return and escalate the violence. One of the key points the prosecution focused on was the fact that Thompson had to reload his weapon during the attack. This was not something that happened in a split second. It required deliberate action, required awareness, and most importantly, it created a pause. A pause in which anyone could have stopped if the prior actions had been the result of losing control. But Thompson did not stop. He continued, and that very detail became direct evidence of premeditation, the element required to elevate the charge to capital murder. In addition to the prosecution's arguments, the trial was bolstered by a series of witnesses and physical evidence. Police officers involved in the investigation described the crime scene, the number of shell casings, the locations of bullet marks, and how they reflected a purposeful attack. Forensic pathologists provided detailed reports on the victim's wounds, confirming that Darren Cain was shot multiple times in lethal areas, with no chance of survival, while Denise Hisley was shot in the face, causing severe damage that led to her death after a week of treatment. Those reports not only described the consequences, but also reinforced the manner in which the crime was committed: close range, precise, and without hesitation. Denise's statement before falling into a coma was presented as key evidence. Though she could not appear in court, her identification of the shooter had been documented in medical records and in the statements of witnesses present at the scene. This was one of the most personal elements of the case, when the victim herself, in her final moments of consciousness, pointed to the person responsible for it all. Additionally, the gun recovered from Cypress Creek after Thompson had discarded it was analyzed and matched to the shell casings at the scene. That match eliminated any doubt about the weapon, and when combined with Thompson's confession, the picture became complete. He did not deny shooting them, but what the prosecution sought to prove was not just the act itself, but the intent behind it. However, one of the most shocking elements of the trial was not the murder itself, but what Thompson did after his arrest. In July 1998, while in custody awaiting trial, Thompson attempted to hire someone to kill a key witness in the case. This information did not come from speculation. It came from the testimony of a fellow inmate who reported it to authorities. From there, law enforcement set up a covert operation. An undercover agent posing as a hitman was sent to meet Thompson, and the entire conversation was recorded. In the recording, Thompson directly discussed eliminating the witness and clearly confirmed his intent. This was not merely an additional crime. It was powerful proof that even while facing the justice system, Thompson continued to act with the same mindset, control, and eliminate anyone who stood in his way. For the jury, this detail carried special weight. It showed that the murder was not the endpoint of his criminal behavior, but part of an ongoing pattern. A person willing to kill two people and then try to kill a witness to avoid conviction could not be seen as having lost control in a single moment. It was a deliberate pattern of conduct. Throughout the trial, the prosecution did not need to weave a complicated story. They simply placed the evidence side by side, returning with a gun, reloading, firing multiple shots, disposing of the weapon, confessing to the acts, and later attempting to hire someone to kill a witness. Each individual piece was serious enough, but together they formed a picture that could not be justified. On April 14, 1999, after hearing all the testimony, reviewing every piece of evidence, and evaluating the defendant's entire course of conduct, the jury in Harris County, Texas returned its final verdict. Charles Victor Thompson was guilty of capital murder. It was the result of piecing together every detail presented throughout the trial, from the gunshots in the early morning of April 30, 1998, to the reloading, returning to the scene, disposing of the weapon, and even the plot to hire a hitman while in custody. And in the Texas legal system, for a case with all the elements of intentional killing, multiple victims, and obstruction of justice, the maximum penalty was death. The death sentence was imposed not only based on the outcome, but on the way the crime was carried out. Thompson did not act in a moment of impulse. He left, had time to think, returned armed, continued the attack even as the victims tried to flee, and did not stop until he ensured they had no chance of survival. The fact that he had to reload midway further reinforced that this was a conscious act, not an unconscious reflex. Moreover, the plot to hire someone to kill a witness showed he was not only trying to evade punishment, but was still willing to use violence to achieve his goals. All those factors combined to create a record the jury could not overlook. When the sentence was pronounced, the atmosphere in the courtroom was not merely the end of a legal process, but the moment when the consequences of violent behavior were named clearly. For the families of Darren Cain and Glenda Denise Hisley, it was not complete closure. No verdict could bring their loved ones back. But it was the official acknowledgement that what happened was a grave and unacceptable crime. Victim impact statements during this phase reflected the prolonged pain not only from the deaths of their loved ones, but from the way they died. One shot dead on the spot, the other fighting for a week before succumbing. Those details did not vanish after the trial. They continued to live in the memories of those left behind. Meanwhile, Thompson's reaction painted a completely different picture. There was no clear sign of emotional collapse, no strong display of remorse. He did not respond in the way many would expect from a defendant just sentenced to death. Instead, his demeanor was described as controlled, almost cold. This aligned with how he had behaved all along, both during the crime and throughout the trial. A person always trying to maintain control, even when facing the most severe consequences. The absence of remorse was not just an emotional matter. In the context of the case, it further reinforced the conclusion that his actions were not the result of a momentary loss of control, but choices made with full awareness. After the death sentence was handed down on April 14, 1999, and Thompson was transferred to the Polunsky unit, many might have thought the story was over, that the justice system had dealt with an especially grave case. But for Charles Victor Thompson, the pattern of defiance and control did not end. On November 3, 2005, while still incarcerated, he carried out one of the boldest escapes in Texas history. No gunfire, no chaos, but the cold calculation in how he executed it was what made it so disturbing. Thompson used a fake identification card, wore civilian clothes he had hidden in advance, removed his restraints, and simply walked out of the secure area as if he belonged there. He passed security personnel, unchecked and unsuspected, and left the prison through the main gate in broad daylight. This was not an impulsive act. It was audacity backed by the belief that he could beat the system once again. After escaping, Thompson did not disappear immediately. Within 3 days, he traveled about 200 miles, leaving Texas and entering Louisiana. During that time, he tried to avoid detection, even at one point posing as a hurricane victim to blend into crowds and reduce the risk of being recognized. But that freedom did not last. On November 6, 2005, he was spotted outside a store in Louisiana and taken into custody without significant resistance. His identity was quickly confirmed, and the escape ended. Being recaptured not only returned him to prison, but also demonstrated that no matter how much he calculated, he could not escape the long-term consequences of his actions. After being recaptured, Thompson was returned to death row at Polunsky Unit, where he continued to wait for nearly 2 decades. That period did not change the nature of the case, but it prolonged its consequences. The victims' families continued to live with the painful memories, while the legal system handled appeals that stretched over many years. Finally, on September 11, 2025, an execution warrant was officially issued, setting the date for the conclusion of a case that had lasted nearly 30 years. Execution date: January 28, 2026, in Texas, by lethal injection. On that day, at age 55, Thompson was awakened in the morning to enter the final hours of his life. There was no drama, only a cold and precise procedure. He spent time reading, meeting with his attorney, and speaking with a spiritual advisor. No family members visited, no loved ones were present. It was an ending in complete isolation. Around 6 p.m., he was taken into the execution chamber. His body was secured to the gurney. Intravenous lines were established to prepare for the injection. When asked for his last statement, Thompson said he hoped the victims' families could find forgiveness and that no one wins in a situation like this. Those words sounded remorseful, but they could not erase what had happened. The lethal injection process began and lasted about 15 minutes. In the first few minutes, according to witnesses, he showed signs of discomfort with slight body movements and irregular breathing before gradually losing consciousness. It was not an instant death, but a slow process that reflected the gravity of the punishment itself. At approximately 6:15 p.m., his death was officially pronounced. That was the endpoint of a chain of behavior that began with control in a relationship, escalated into violence, became murder, and continued with attempts to evade consequences. From returning with a gun, reloading, pursuing the victims, to disposing of the weapon and later escaping prison, every action reflected the same thing. This was not a temporary loss of control. This was a person who repeatedly made wrong choices, and each choice led to more severe consequences than the one before. What ended on January 28, 2026, was not just the life of a defendant, but the final point of a pattern of behavior that spanned nearly 3 decades. And when looking back at the entire case, what remains is not complexity, but clarity. Not anger, not love, but the choice to kill. If you want to continue following real cases with detailed perspectives and in-depth analysis, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching to the end. See you in the next video.